Welcome to the Soft Rebellion podcast, a homecoming to the creative power of your female body. Our world uproots us from the gifts of the feminine, the intuitive, the instinctual, the cyclical, the soft. What's the result? Patriarchal cultures of perfectionism, shame, and disconnect that leave us constantly running, never arriving. Imagine a world of women softly rebelling, claiming our cyclicity, our weirdness and our rest as we courageously cultivate a deep and delicious relationship to our female bodies. My name is Florina. I'm an osteopath, dancer, writer and coach. I've been on my own journey sparked by an eating disorder to come home to the wild, poetic anatomy of my female body and awaken my creative power. And I invite you to join me and my guests, trailblazing teachers, healers and creatives, as we each reclaim our own soft rebellion. Hello and welcome back to the Soft Rebellion podcast. And I just noticed to episode 48. Wow. We have come a long way. Welcome in the space of the Soft Rebellion. I'm so excited to release and share this conversation with you about menstrual activism, indulging the impulse to resist and let your anger guide you home. Today's conversation is, how should I say that, such a wonderful chain reaction or a very organic unfolding contribution, reflection of the journey I've been on. It's very much actually since last summer, since late summer when I launched the Soft Rebellion in the first place, that I have been on a deep dive and journey all about this global menstrual movement and menstruality movement, and really exploring this term, this theme, exploring menstruality through all possible lenses, through my very own experience, but also through a social context, historical, and on that quest and path. I remember so well, it was at one point just before Christmas when I had a conversation with an amazing woman who some of you might know, Dr. Cree Dai. She will be on the podcast in March. And as I shared with her where I am in my process, writing and research, she said, you have to read that one book called Out for Blood. And this book, Out for Blood, is written by a woman called Breanne Fahs. And I've read that book once and twice and three times, and then I've read many other books written by this amazing woman and researcher and writer. And then I've invited her onto the podcast. And together we explored her experience of growing up in a menstruating body, how she met this strong narrative and what protected her from seeing her body as an object but a powerful individual. We talked about her so rebellious writing and research, and we talked about what menstrual activism actually means and is, and how we all can step into the menstrual activists we are and tap into that spark of feminism which is in all of us. Let me share with you a little bit more about today's guests. Breanne is a professor of women and gender studies at Arizona State University, where she specializes in studying women's sexuality, critical embodiment studies, feminist histories, and political activism. She has authored so many books, including most recently Unshaved and Burn It Down, Feminist Manifestos for the Revolution. I highly recommend that one as well. She is the founder and director of the Feminist Research on Gender and Sexuality Group at Arizona State University, and she also works as a clinical psychologist in private practice. And no more words from my side. Let's dive in, lean back and enjoy. Welcome, welcome on the podcast,
Thank you.
Breanne. Yeah, it's you're one of these people or writers. I've read so much about it, and if I could, I would, it's almost difficult to start on one level because there is so much I would love to talk with you about. And this is the Soft Rebellion podcast, and you did what I would say absolutely, you did big and bold work and research and writing in your life, which is very rebellious, so needed, the shaming. You do it so shamelessly. And you're not just an inspiration, but I feel like a trailblazing person for younger women like me who want to follow a similar path.
That's so nice. Thank
Um,
you.
and yeah, first and foremost, I just really want to acknowledge and honor the work you do and that you dare and dared to do the work.
Oh, thank you so much. That's such a nice thing to say.
And yeah, there would be so many themes to explore, and we'll just start somewhere today. But before we dive deeper into that one particular work of yours, Out for Blood, that's one of my very favorite books. I would love to go a little bit back in time and in your history and lived experience. And this the subtitle of this podcast is what I call it's about reclaiming the hunger of the female body. It's about it's for me about this homecoming journey or a homecoming journey. I don't know yet what what it exactly is about, but I would love to hear from your journey and maybe take us back as much as it needs. I would love to get a smell and a taste for what was your hunger which led you, which guided you onto onto this rebellious path. Maybe let's
Ah,
start there. How not everyone is. Would you describe yourself as a menstrual activist amongst the many titles?
sure, yes. In terms of menstruation, I've just always been interested in the ways in which, even from the first moment that you start menstruating, there's stories about why you're supposed to keep it hidden. And I think those are deeply internalized too.
Mhm,
I was someone who started my period quite young, and so
mhm,
I remember my first instinct was to immediately conceal it, right? And of course, feel lots of, conflict about it. I was a competitive swimmer then, so I didn't have an easy option for concealing it aside from dealing with it directly, learning how to use tampons early. But I do think, that sense, all of the things that I work on in terms of rebellion are also because I too write myself into these narratives that felt so strong when I was like an adolescent, right? Of
mhm,
just concealment of, not being sure how to sort of grapple with the needs of the body. I found puberty to be
mhm,
quite alarming. Again, through the frame of being a competitive swimmer, I always felt like it was a liability, right? To like sort of, growing breasts was a liability, menstruating was a liability. It all felt like it was kind of a sabotaging force for me. Um,
mhm,
that said, I don't think I had a particularly troubling body image or negative feelings about my body, but I do think back to adolescence and really think about, I think some of those stories definitely started to form then about just, how do you grapple with what it means to like grow up and the ways that the body is kind of implicated in that. And I think I was lucky because I had some protective stories
mhm,
around me. I had a really wonderful mother who, was very, very thoughtful and loving and encouraging and not body shaming. I had sports that really protected me in some
mhm,
ways from seeing myself as an object. I realize now looking back too that being an athlete when you're young really lets you be a subject, not an object, right? So
mhm,
you get to think about your body in terms of what it can do, not how it looks. All the girls and women I was around, none of us
mhm,
really wore makeup. None of us were really into clothes. Like, we
mhm,
weren't into this idea of thinking of our bodies as objects. We were much more interested in having the fastest times or, like being as strong as possible or improving ourselves, in terms of athleticism. And I think that really protected me
Mhm.
from the feeling of being an object. And I do really think that has carried throughout my career and my thinking about bodies, is that that feels so powerful. I think, and even in adolescence, to have dodged a lot of that stuff where you equate, as girls do, you equate your worth as a teenage girl with how desirable you are, how
Mhm.
attractive you are, how much boys specifically like you. I mean, that just
Mhm.
like not to say that that had no bearing, but it just was such a secondary story compared to the
Mhm.
story of seeing myself as strong and powerful and
Mhm.
fast, and all the things that come with that. So um I also think, related to the swimming when I was young,
Mhm.
I also got to, there was the story that also developed then related to my sort of rebellions later, around growing body hair, because it was normative for the whole team to grow out their body hair and then shave all of their body hair right before the big race at the end of the season. And so I got to experiment with
Mhm.
a kind of collective that was doing, when I look back now, I realized doing, body hair rebellions without really necessarily calling it that or imagining it that.
Mhm.
But that was also very formative, right? That thinking about, well, why should I be shaving? What's the point of this, right? It's like it brings up lots of question marks about why should we be, adapting to these norms that seem really quite silly once you start breaking them. And that really led to a lifetime of also thinking quite critically about the necessity of women's body hair shaving, and how I think,
Mhm.
I think having an early introduction to that just really changed a lot of things inside of me. So yeah, those are kind of my introductory stories about that. But yeah.
Wow, oh, you open up many wonderful doorways and paths we could go. I it's it's interesting. I have a that you talk about subject and object and the law object, and I love how you say several times that or how you start to recognize what protective factors you had, which made you not just be thrown into the world as an object called a female body, and makes me immediately aware of, wow, gosh, yeah, that's the thought really the new culture needs to have, right? What are the, I guess that's a lot to do with the awareness, or what are the protective, what is that, with great love, protective new culture. Protective may not precisely the right word, but how can we prevent young girls growing into objects, which
Right, yeah.
so
And
logical,
especially
but
as
thanks for
early as
reminding.
possible. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
when you're young, when you're
Mm-hmm.
really young and coming
Mm-hmm.
to this early,
Mm-hmm.
there's so many things that I think really can help people to feel like they're not just swallowed by that, I mean, I also grew up in a
Mm-hmm.
household of women, so that was really helpful, my mother and my sister. So we didn't have a constant influence of um, kind of like the patriarchal narrative of women as having value
Mm-hmm.
through their, like, through these sort of traditional femininity channels. I mean, yeah, if I look back now, there was lots of things like that that I was very lucky to have, that I think really helped me to develop as a feminist, as an activist, as a, kind of a body advocate. I don't know what else. Lots of roles
Mm-hmm.
there as, women's studies
Mm.
person. Yeah.
Yeah, and exactly, and how you, as an athlete, you really use your body as a subject, and you discovered your strength and your power. And I think, wow, that is one definition of that homecoming to the hunger. I think isn't the hunger about we all crave for actually getting in touch with our literally bloody power and strength,
Hmm.
which exactly if we aren't in a environment where that really gets celebrated, or kind of where there is a
Yeah,
space
yeah.
for that, then a girl growing
Right,
up
because at
might
the
completely
precise
miss that.
age, yeah, I mean, exactly, the precise age where girls often start to shrink,
Mhm.
athleticism and sport really helped, at least me, and I think many others, to expand, right? So there's the shrink,
Mhm.
you see like the wild, feral child, right? The 8-year old, 9-year-old who's very, even younger, maybe 6, 7, even, you see that, right? Just they're wild, they're in their bodies, they play, they run around, they don't have that sort of self-consciousness, and then puberty hits, and that can be such a shrinking of that reality, right? They go from being this wild kind of feral animal to
Mhm.
being suddenly very aware of the need to be more demure, more quiet, more
Mhm.
self-conscious, more inward, right? And like I think if there's mechanisms to help girls not do that, I think it's so powerful, right? Just to not experience that adolescent shrinking, you know?
Yes, I love that image of exactly as a child with that wild animal within us. It's just pouring out of us with no questions, with no doubts. It's just because we are wild animals and wild animals. I keep forgetting who said that quote. It's in one of my wonderful books. And then that shrinking, yes, that's what happens. And you see that, for example, in my case, that's exactly what happens. I the year I had my menarche was the year when I developed my eating disorder, the year I had my first bleed, and I literally physically shrank, right? And on
Yeah.
so many other levels too. That actually really hits it.
Yeah.
So, mm, and you also, I thought how interesting you started meeting menstruation and but well, not but all the things which defined you as female, as inhabiting your body part, and you met it as a sabotaging force.
Yeah.
Um, so tell us what happens then? What's maybe in term? Yeah, take us in a bit more there. What's so here you were, you did athletics. You said body hair rebellions without knowing. And was it suddenly a very conscious, did you know, wow, that's what I want to study, research, what I want to bring to the
Mhm.
world, or how did your journey go
Yeah, I mean,
on?
I think, you know, as a teenager, I don't think that had yet occurred to me, although all of these seeds were planted, like I mentioned. You know, I think, and I'd certainly made more peace with my body as I grew up, you know, in my later teenage years. But I do think college was another huge turning point for me, you know, attending college and reading feminist theory and, you know, really diving into all kinds of narratives about the body and sexuality, and then pairing that with experiences that I was having in my own life was really quite profound. And so my when I was 19 or 20, I started working on my undergraduate thesis about orgasms. And I really felt
Mm-hmm.
like this was like the quintessential site where we could see all aspects of women's oppression. I don't know, I still
Mm-hmm.
really love this topic, I have to say. I love thinking about sexuality, but also specifically like the ways in which orgasm is a mirror to the culture, and like all of the things that happen with
Mm-hmm.
orgasm are sort of, I think, broader reflections of what happened in lots of other ways. So
Mm-hmm.
you know, I was obsessed with the idea of like, why would women be faking orgasm? Why would orgasm show up in all these different ways? How is it depicted in film and literature? How are we sort of thinking about anger and emotion related to sex, right? All this
Mm-hmm.
stuff was coming up at the end of my time as a university student. And so I think, um, you know, in terms of body rebellions, I remember, you know, having a lot of experimentation with body stuff when I was in college. But then for my college graduation, you know, again, very kind of, I don't know, those kinds of moments seem very conservative, I guess, in their nature, right? You're supposed to, I
Mm-hmm.
remember wearing a salmon colored dress and feeling sort of out of, like, I didn't really want to be wearing a dress, but I felt obligated to wear a dress. No one told me to wear it. I just felt like, oh, when you graduate, you're supposed to be wearing this certain kind of performance and production of femininity. And then I also remember thinking, oh, you know, I hadn't been shaving my body hair, and so I decided to shave my body hair for this graduation. And I think that was a major turning point. Was at the end of that evening, I thought, I'm not going to engage with this kind of performance of femininity again. And at that point, I just decided, like, I'm not going to shave anymore. I'm not going to, like, so there was, like, I think it was a big moment of feeling like I had betrayed myself in some way. And again, not with anyone telling me to do it. There was never an outside force that explicitly said it. It was something that I had just internalized. And I think, you know, it was a culmination in some ways of just realizing, like, I don't have to play along with any of this. I don't have to play along. And I think that has been a really driving force ever since. And so, um Yeah, I think, these things don't happen with a light switch sort of thing, right? They
Mm.
kind of build and build. I'd always, even as a young child, been sort of infuriated by the idea that, God was a man. What? I remember as a
Mhm.
child, just when I would go to church, I would constantly change all of the references to he in the Bible to a she, and my mother was horrified by this. I would, I was violating the Bible. She wasn't a very big religious
Mhm.
person, but she definitely didn't want me, graffitiing the Bibles in the Catholic Church. So eventually, I sort of stopped doing that. But what I'm saying is the impulse to question, why are women second class citizens here? Why is everyone worshiping a man? I was
Mhm.
very weirded out by that, even very young. So I think, as many people will say, their feminist instincts or their sense of recognizing, inequality about gender can often happen quite early, and it certainly did for me. But how that translated to the body was a later story, right? So that sort of unfolded in adolescence, and then certainly when I was a college student, and then of course beyond. So yeah, and in terms of menstrual activism, that was like a lightning bolt hitting me when I had discovered that anyone else thought about that stuff, and anyone else was thinking about, um, just wanting to fight back against the shame and the stigma stories, right? Just
Mhm.
I felt like
Mhm.
I hated having those, and I hated carrying them, and it was so nice to feel like you could set them down, and it was so wonderful actually. So, and again, my entry point into thinking about any aspect of menstruation was through sexuality, because I was a sexuality researcher. So I was
Yes.
interested in the things that kept coming up. When I was a graduate student, I started to interview women about sex, and they would talk about sex during their periods as particularly horrifying to them. And that was my entry point into thinking about menstruation, was, my God, this is like such an intimate,
Mhm.
amazing thing. And they still feel,
Mhm.
women overwhelmingly feel like they're gross and disgusting, and it's dirty and it's bad, right? Like when they're thinking about menstrual sex. So my first research thing about menstruation was around menstrual sex, and that really opened up a whole world of being connected to menstrual activists and menstrual researchers. So yeah, it's funny to reconstruct this story
Mm.
now. I don't think I've ever actually done that with anyone, so it's fun.
Ah, yeah. And it's so interesting having just read, you read a book from someone which is related to a certain kind of movement they were in at that moment of the but and it's wonderful to kind of dive into that's like that big big tree. I really want to kind of highlight something you said or acknowledge that moment you shared when you finished college, and you used the word you felt like even no one told you that you betrayed anyone or that you betrayed yourself, but you felt like I betrayed myself. And you realized I don't have to play along. I actually don't have to play along. And I just really want to highlight that because I know that many listeners, consciously or unconsciously, there is the kind of the real energy or message in that gosh, I betrayed myself. I know that many will be able to relate to that, or that it on an unspoken level, I feel it resonates with us. I think I got to a similar place
Yeah,
when
yeah. And I think, we often have these fears, right? That if we
Mhm.
allow ourselves to inhabit our bodies as they are, as we want them to be, even, that somehow we'll just face this enormous amount of rejection, and that our lives will be so much harder. But actually, I found it to be the opposite, right? Where when I was going through periods of trying to adapt my body to other people's expectations, I wasn't around people that were as interesting to me, or as cool or fun, or I don't know. And I think, I remember thinking specifically, as people do, right? Of like, well, I wonder how this will affect my dating life or my sex life or whatever. And
Mhm.
actually, it was great, right? I ended up, partnering with people that were just inherently, I think, more left leaning, more committed to bodily autonomy for women, right? And I
Mhm.
think like
Mhm.
that really means something. There's a certain kind of person that doesn't have an impulse to control women's bodies. And I think when you end up partnering with those kind of people, you really see like you've been missing out, like it's really,
Mhm.
there's a lot of, it really produces like a profound bond and connection and things like that. So I guess my point is that at
Mm-hmm.
least, even as a therapist, I hear a lot of people be afraid of, of gaining weight, of growing body hair, of being more open about their menstruation, during sex, whatever. And I think, I do want to encourage people who are potentially listening to this to consider that it actually might be a benefit, right? It's a benefit to inhabit your body as it is and invite other people into that versus trying to adapt your body to what other people want and feeling, smaller, lesser, more kind of deflated. I don't know what word to use, but just
Mm-hmm.
not fully
Mm-hmm.
yourself, right? It's good to sort of like be a self that then other people can sort of take it or leave it. And the people um join you in your sort of body journey, right, often can be really
Mm-hmm.
fantastic people. So I will say that was a
I'm
fear.
very
If I'm
glad.
yeah,
Yeah,
if
I'm
I'm
very glad that you
reconstructing
just.
my end of college worry, right? It was
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
well, this could have a real negative effect on my relational life, and actually it didn't, which is the good thing, I think. So yeah.
I'm very glad that you said what you just said, because my follow-up question would have been, so wow, how did you navigate the after that decision? I'm not playing along. How did you navigate all these, yeah, I guess
Yeah. Well, I
fears
mean,
or
it
worries, or
became
but you
more a
just gave an
part of
answer. Yeah.
myself, like
Mm-hmm.
I I just think that has been true, especially
Mm-hmm.
since that moment. I just remember that very particular moment being like, I'm done with this, right? And that's happened to me many times in my life where you kind of go along with a thing, whatever it is, and then you just realize one day that you're not doing that anymore, right? And those have been
Mm-hmm.
really important, profound moments actually for me, and really helpful to whatever it is, like a narrative, an expectation, a story, um I don't know, whatever it is, when you just decide I'm not doing this anymore. And then, what it does is it invests you with a feeling of, it's not just like a boundary in that therapeutic language, but
Mm-hmm.
a sense of I'm going to inhabit myself in this way, and I hope others will
Mm-hmm.
join me. And if they don't, it's okay, right? And I think that has been really
Mm-hmm.
kind of how I've moved through the world ever since. It's been really important to me to sort of, not to say that I don't adapt to other people's needs. Of course you do in relationships and things, but you also, you don't bend yourself into a million directions that don't feel good to try to adapt to other people's expectations. Like, you kind of invite them to join you and they invite you to join them. I mean, part of, I think, having successful romantic relationships is like a very, very deep level of acceptance of someone else's wildness, and your own, right? Just like you're a wild animal and so are they. And I don't mean that in like a bodily sense either, as much as just
Mm-hmm.
they've got their stuff and you've got your stuff, and you're in it together. And that's kind of like a nice, even in friendships, I feel like that's true, just really accepting other people's, you know beings in that way. It's important.
I'm just taking a little break from my conversation with Breanne to ask you for help. And I have to smile in that moment, because right now it is partly my anger and rage which is guiding me to say these words which I say now. The Soft Rebellion, this podcast, all this work I do for me, for us, this work which is being done through me. Sometimes I do actually notice an anger of how can I reach more people? There's so much energy going into that. How can I receive? How can I spread it wider so that I can receive wider? How can I really make this a conversation with other human beings, menstruators and women out there? And that's where I need your help. If you enjoy this podcast, if you enjoy these conversations, it would be so great if you could give us a follow, share this podcast, this episode with all your friends and family. Follow me on social media at florina.tali, and help me to spread this with the world. And this is also a shout out. Do get in touch with me. Send me the email softrebellion@florinatali.com and share with me what are your takeaways. What are you taking away from these conversations? Share with me who you would like to be to have as a guest on this podcast, what themes and topics you are really hungry for to be explored, and also if you would like to be a guest on this podcast and share with all of us your softly rebellious expression. I'm so much looking forward to hearing from you. Let's head back to the conversation with Breanne. That is wow, yeah, connection is about accepting our wildness, me accepting yours and you accepting mine. And if you, the other, you said so beautifully, you made the decision, I'm going to inhabit myself the way I truly am. Just, yeah. And I guess that's the moment when we start to connect with that wildness. And if you live yours, there is this open invitation for me to live mine too.
Yeah.
And that's how one by one we create a new
Exactly.
culture.
Yeah. And even with emotions, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
true. It's like I think a lot of gender norms, we want women to contain their feelings and, not be too much and not cry at work, not, I don't know. And not that I have done a lot of that, but I have learned to accept that there's going to be times when emotions are also not fully containable, that you just have to kind of
Mm-hmm.
bring to the table what you are, even in those settings, even in professionally or otherwise, like there's I think it we benefit greatly from when we don't have to fragment ourselves as much, right? So I think that's part of what
Yes.
menstrual activism is too. Going back to that is,
Mm-hmm.
we this is a part of not fragmenting yourself, not pretending that you don't menstruate, not enforcing the silence and the secrecy onto yourself. And that has really been important to me, not just in the sense of menstruation, but in this much bigger project of, you know, part of menstrual activists' central kind of core statements and goals is to like not have, people have to fragment themselves so much and have these, even just like we do so much better in the world when we can think about our bodies having needs and addressing them, right? And so much of life is people feeling like they have these bodily needs that they can't address, right? Whether it's chronic pain or hunger or right, just
Mm-hmm.
like I don't know, just like whatever discomfort or things that their bodies need. They're tired. They have to override that with all this caffeine or something. I think that's especially true in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
That we teach people to not deal with the needs of their body or to feel like they're supposed to constantly push that off. I mean, shift work often does this. I know
Mm-hmm.
people who work in factories that don't get bathroom breaks. I mean, this is a part of this fundamental sense that like our bodies are meant to be, they're just these troublesome things that get in the way. And I think menstrual activists have really like, laid some important ground and territory of marking that that's not the case, right? That like bodies have needs and the menstruating body is going to show up and we can try to like suppress it and get rid of the blood and have no evidence of it, but people are still feeling lots of things about it, whether it's emotional dysregulation or pain or just feeling lower energy or whatever, right? And so just trying to honor
Mm-hmm.
that helps us to honor other parts of our bodily needs as well. And I think in a capitalist society we treat bodies as nuisances, and they're not, right? They deserve to have space to feel and need things and
Mm-hmm.
exist. And I think menstrual activism is really profound that way. And as I get older, I feel that need even more, right? Just like how do we take care of
Mm-hmm.
the needs of our bodies and not feel like we're supposed to just suppress all of that and keep it all silent and secret?
Oh, now I get really excited when you lay out all these parts, because one question I feel the world needs menstrual activism for the collective healing, for the collective homecoming, not just for me as a woman, but for the woman of the world or for the feminine of the world. Um, bound to gender. So, oh gosh, yes, a huge yes to everything you said. And it's so interesting. I haven't looked at menstrual activism as what you said. It's basically about not fragmenting yourself. And immediately there, I saw the word wholeness. Menstrual activism is an act of coming back home to the wholeness I am,
Yeah.
and to exactly recognize, wow, in a way, also very simply, my body has needs, and I nurture or listen to those needs. My big personal menstrual activism act has been to reclaim my rest exactly in a society where
Mm,
someone feel I'm supposed to be on 48 hours, 7 days, and constantly produce and deliver and work and do. Um, and it's so interesting how I'm very busy, as you know, with the whole work of menstrual cycle awareness, which is an amazing movement which grew in the UK with Red School, which is really very practical tools for menstruators to how to how to navigate the phases of menstruation and what does it mean, what really helps to really see those needs and listen to them and to really explore also the wildness. And I feel the work you and so many more menstrual activists do, because it is about, fighting back against that shame and disgust towards it. Like, I see how you are like curving that big container for then menstrual cycle awareness people to come in. But first we need to fight back to create the space. And maybe
yeah.
that brings us more to out for blood. And let's dive deeper in there if you still have time. Um, because I don't know, at one point in the book, you talk about that new culture, or maybe it's actually in the back of the book, you are kind of fighting or going forwards for. And you talk about that coming together of the joy and the natural rhythm and the wildness of menstruation and also
Yeah.
shame of menstrual resistance. And maybe let's start with what does menstrual resistance mean? Because I'm aware that many people have listened think, oh,
Yeah.
what is that about? What is coming together
Yeah,
there?
yeah. I mean, I think, and again, it's certainly not, it doesn't exist in a silo, right? It draws from so many other kinds of resistance movements, whether that's the anarchist movement or a
Mhm.
long history of rambunctious feminist activism and things. But, the menstrual resistance, I think, can be, again, enacted both individually and personally or collectively. You see it in terms of artistic, political, cultural sort of expressions, all three really. And I'm really interested in tracing that, right? And looking at where that shows up and why, who's doing what, and all the ways in which even seemingly small actions can produce these very large reactions in people.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, and menstrual activist work just spans such an enormous amount of space, right? So thinking about teaching women to chart their cycles, looking at fighting back against like the kind of menstrual product industry that keeps dioxins and tampons and keeps dyeing tampons even though they don't need it to make them more white, and then they that exposes people who use tampons to more health hazards, to kind of the shutting down of various kinds of reusable product companies and industries, and like kind of sidelining them. Procter and Gamble, of course, has taken over the menstrual education programs in our elementary schools in the US. So girls don't get, for the most part, don't get taught about menstruation from actual teachers or nurses or anything like that. They get taught from a corporate curriculum that ends with handing girls samples of Procter and Gamble's products, right? And being like, become, knowing that they will likely become lifetime consumers of these kinds of products. So, menstrual activists, they've fought against the over medicalization of menstruation. They've fought against um, treating women like they're mentally ill when they're having cycling mood issues related to menstruation. They have fought against like all kinds of mechanisms of silence and secrecy and shame that kind of permeate the culture. They've been critical of film and TV representations that are troubling and treat menstruation in negative ways. That again, people have thought about activism related to sexuality, activism related to campaigns that talk more openly about menstruation. There's been some really interesting ones all over Europe where people put billboards in public transit. There's just so much. It's such a rich movement,
Mhm.
right? And so many different aspects of that. Better menstrual education. It's like just there's so many wings of what it means to engage in menstrual resistance. So yeah, I've been really interested in that, and even of course, like I mentioned, down to the level of the hatred that we have, all over the world for cycles in general, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we sort of, again, that, and I now I think am more keen to attribute that to the kind of byproducts of capitalism, right? That capitalism
Mm-hmm.
requires us to be working all the time and producing all the time. So it can't acknowledge things like seasons and cycles and need for rest and
Mm-hmm.
leisure. I mean, all of that gets sort of like destroyed under the terms of capitalism. And so, um, that goes down to the mundane level of the body, which is interesting, right? Just thinking about the ways that our bodies kind of, we end up denying even our own cycles. Or if you look at the way that women experience pregnancy, oftentimes it's like with a feeling that they need to immediately return their bodies to the state that they were in pre-pregnancy, to return to work, at least in the
Mm-hmm.
US, as quickly as possible, to almost deny that this massive thing has happened, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that is also encouraged very much by workplaces and by the sort of governmental policies, and especially, like I said, in the US, where we don't even have a kind of federal maternity leave. A lot of people in Europe don't know this, but we don't have, there's nothing that at a federal level that protects women who've given birth, right? Just in terms of making sure they have time to rest. Many companies require women to take sick leave. And of course, pregnancy and childbirth is not a sickness, so it's very
Mm-hmm.
tricky how this all works, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also very
Mm-hmm.
poignant and telling of
Mm-hmm.
the need for menstrual activism, which is not, of course, just about menstruation, but about all sorts of other things, right? If we think about menopause and reproductive
Mm-hmm.
rights, abortion rights, even I expanded out into like even just the kind of
Mm-hmm.
recognition of bodies that are marked as abject, or again, fatness, body hair, queerness. There's so many implications just
Mm-hmm.
everywhere about what menstrual resistance can offer us. So yeah, it's exciting to me. I
Mm-hmm.
love talking about it and thinking about it. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's in a way also deeply touching how menstrual activism is a movement or is an act which, yes, we fight again the shame and disgust of menstruation, but also we fight against or rebel for a new word with or we doch we fight against capitalism and patriarchy and so many more things. It's like
Mhm.
it's I'm seeing a certain image now, but it's wonderful. It's touching how menstrual activism is penetrating so much more and so much deeper. It's like literally pouring itself out where the power of menstruation needs to go and do some work in a world where we are pretty much in a mess, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think, even people who aren't activists or don't
Mm-hmm,
would never imagine themselves to be, there's a
mm-hmm,
little there's a spark of fury, I think, in most women
mm-hmm,
about having to grow up in a patriarchal capitalistic culture around menstruation, right? Like they can identify with the feeling of disaster that sort of lurks of, if I bleed through my clothes at an inopportune time, what are the consequences of that to me? Or why was I
mm-hmm,
made to like feel so much embarrassment or shame about this, right? So people connect, I think, with the idea, if they have even the slightest sort of feminist impulse in them, they connect with the idea that menstruation um shouldn't be treated the way that it is, and they want it to be different. So I love it as an inroads also with students, with young women. They
mm-hmm,
can immediately, I think, identify with, like, they want more power, and this is an obvious way that their power
mm-hmm,
has been taken away, and is being taken away, actually, and will continue to be taken away, quite frankly, if we look at just the abysmal
mm-hmm,
sort of lack of knowledge about menopause, for example, or perimenopause.
mm-hmm.
That's the same story repeated again and again, right? Of just neglect of women's cycles and what they need, as they, from the first time they bleed all the way till the last, right? It's interesting.
Yes.
And beyond, really.
Mm. That's another great quote you said, like that feminist spark in us, which yes, I agree, I know that we we all have that in us. And you are one of those very brave, yeah, doch, it's brave, it is brave beings, and you kind of you really let that become a big fire, and it needs many more of us to do that too. And it brings us back to
Yes.
the very beginning when you talked from your experience as a college student when you had that, in a way, light bulb moment of, wow, you felt you betrayed yourself. We betray that, we neglect, we push away that feminist spark, that voice saying, I want power. And I had the same with the eating disorder. I mean, you lose your power on all levels if you stop eating, right?
Mm.
You lose your power. And the big light bulb for me, and that really ties into that, was when I noticed, my gosh, yes, it is about me, but this is also not about me. This is about the world and the society I grew up in. It's in a way fascinating when that kind of clicked, I recovered so quickly because I
Yeah.
noticed this is not, it's not about me, and I'm actually not doing this just for me. I do that for the world, if I say, and I reclaim my power.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I mean that you're so right. It's like we have to mine our own experiences to understand the world, right? At
Hmm.
least at the beginning. And then we can sort of
Hmm.
start wondering about other people's experiences and how they
Hmm.
connect to that. But yes, I mean this is the nature of research and inquiry and curiosity and activism,
Hmm.
right? It's all kind of at its base, trying to make sense of the horror show of our own lives, right? And the things that we
Hmm.
wish were different, and then
Hmm.
looking outward to connect with others who may also be sharing those things or worrying about those things. And, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
So when, oh, for all of us who feel that, who listen and they know exactly, oh yeah, gosh, I feel that feminist spark, which I think often we feel that, or I often feel that with anger and rage and, oh, which with kind of a destroying wildness. But I really would love to ask you from here, how can we all individually and with that collectively be step into our expression of menstrual activism in our very own way, or because we can do
Mm.
without having to do do gender studies and do a PhD, right?
Yeah, yeah. No,
But
absolutely. I mean, I
how
think
can we all
it's
step into it?
yeah, I mean, part of it I think is really seeing that resistance is everywhere and multiple and doesn't look like any one thing, right? So there's resistances that we have that are very like intimate and small and enacted only in our own individual brains even. There's resistances where it's a small collective or even in our own romantic relationships, like I said, or family narratives. And then there's resistances that sort of connect into movements, right? And like all are very important and all really have validity, right? So it's more about thinking about, just the act of refusal for any norm that women are expected to do, for example, is incredibly powerful. Of just saying, I'm
Mhm.
not doing this anymore, whatever it is, I'm refusing this. I'm not going to be cruel to myself in this way, or I'm not going to be constraining myself in this way, or I'm not going to buy into the story that I have more value if I'm thinner, or I have more value and I'm
Mhm.
not bleeding, or just like allowing space for the body to exist as it is really a huge act of rebellion. And that can sometimes connect us to bigger movements or collectives and things, but it doesn't have to. I mean, resistance is the impulse to resist even is important, right? That feeling of anger is so important to nurture in yourself and in others, and to like
Mhm.
not just sort of shut down, right? And not get rid of. And I think indulging that a bit is really
Mhm.
important. Not where it's destructive to other people per se, but where
Mhm.
you think about anger as a guide, right? Like what we're angry about teaches
Mhm.
us what we need to change and what needs to change in our lives. It's the antidote, I think, to intense despair, right? As are other things like friendship and, you know, nature and lots of things. But the despair happens when we don't have an outlet for that anger or we can't recognize it, right? So I don't think we should be afraid of anger. I think anger is really, really important. And, women are so often told not to be angry that even that is an act of rebellion, right? So I would say,
Mhm.
the short answer is we have to
Wow.
think about resistance and rebellion in all kinds of ways. There's not one narrative for that. It's everywhere. It's in us anyway. We just have to pay attention.
Yes. And the first step or the first wow act could be to say, to actually start to see and to acknowledge the anger in in my own life. And because exactly anger kind of arises and, oh gosh, I shouldn't be angry, or we want to keep the peace or whatever. But to really just, I loved how you used the word indulging the impulse to resist, but maybe also in a way indulging the anger I see now. What about a love relationship to anger? We have this hate relationship to anger, and we get taught of the angry child is the bad child, right?
Exactly.
Wow, anger as a guide.
Fun conversation. I'm happy we got to talk about this. Yeah, it's been really good.
I feel that's a good place to stop, and a really good place for all listeners to go and start to reflect and be with resistance and anger. And I might ask you to continue the conversation at one.
Oh yes, anytime. This is so fun, and thank you for doing this. It was a really good conversation. I enjoyed it so much.
Wow. What a wonderful conversation. I'm very much left with these statements. Indulge the impulse to resist. And then harvest whatever is coming out of that indulgeness, out of that indulging. Almost a moment of suspension, breathing into that. And maybe that's what I'm gonna do, meet this moment through my moving body. Thank you so much for all of you to be here. Thank you for have listened to us, to this conversation. And thank you for your ongoing support. If you did enjoy this episode, then share it with all your friends and family. Leave a comment. I so enjoy reading and hearing from you. This is really meant to be a conversation and a collective exploration as well as an expression of my personal exploration. I wish you well, and I'll be with you soon. And until then, go and be your unique, weird, and wonderful self. Lots of love.